Every empire that has ever tried to hold the world through military force alone has collapsed. Every single one, without exception. The Romans held it with legions. The British held it with warships. The Americans held it with aircraft carriers and nuclear bombs. And every one of them, at the peak of their power, failed to see the system that was quietly replacing them. And I want to argue today, using game theory and structural history, that China has built the most sophisticated empire in human history. Not through weapons, not through conquest, but through control. Control of supply chains, control of energy materials, control of manufacturing. And the most alarming part is this. Every crisis that happens in the world, every war, every sanction, every disruption makes China stronger, not weaker, stronger. Let me go back, because I think it is important to understand how we got here. In 2020, when the mainstream consensus was that China was a rising power that would eventually be contained by American economic pressure and military deterrence, I made 4 predictions in this classroom. Prediction 1, China would not blink in the trade war. It would absorb the pain and accelerate its domestic industrial strategy. Prediction 2, the Belt and Road Initiative would not collapse under Western criticism. It would quietly become the dominant infrastructure system across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Prediction 3, Western attempts to decouple from Chinese manufacturing would fail within the technology sector because the supply chain depth was simply too great. Prediction 4, China would use the post-COVID reconstruction period to lock in strategic dominance over rare earth processing and clean energy production. 3 of those 4 predictions have already come true. The 4th is in progress right now. I did not make those predictions because I am special. I made them because I used a method, a framework. I call it predictive history, using game theory and structural patterns from history to understand where things are going. And today, I want to use that same framework to tell you something the mainstream media is not telling you. China is not trying to win a war with America. China is trying to make that war irrelevant. By the time America realizes what has happened, the leverage will already be gone. So how do I make predictions? I'll look at 3 things. First, I'll look at structure. The deep structural forces shaping a situation. Geography, population, economics, these things do not change quickly. They constrain what is possible. Second, I'll look at incentives. In game theory, every player is trying to maximize their own interests. So I ask, what does each player actually want? Not what they say they want, what they actually want. Because those 2 things are almost always different. Third, I'll look at history. Not because history repeats exactly, it does not, but because human beings are human beings. Empires are empires. Certain patterns appear again and again across thousands of years. If you know those patterns, you can see them playing out right now. Now let us look at the players. What does China say it wants? China says it wants peaceful development. It says it wants a multipolar world. It says it respects sovereignty and does not interfere in other nations' affairs. Now, what does China actually want? China wants to displace the United States as the organizing power of the global economy. Not by fighting America directly. That would be too costly and too visible. China wants to build a parallel system. A system where global trade flows, energy contracts, technology standards, and financial agreements run through Beijing rather than Washington. China's leadership understands one thing with absolute clarity. The country that controls the infrastructure of global commerce controls everything without having to fire a single shot. What does the United States say it wants? The United States says it wants a free and open international order. It says it wants fair trade, democratic governance, and rules-based competition. Now, what does the United States actually want? America wants to preserve the dollar-based financial system and the network of military alliances that makes it the indispensable nation. The problem is that these 2 goals are in direct tension. The dollar system requires global trade, and global trade increasingly runs through China. America cannot sanction its way out of this contradiction. What does the global South, India, Brazil, Southeast Asia, the Gulf states, Sub-Saharan Africa say it wants? These nations say they want development, sovereignty, and fair access to global markets. Now, what do they actually want? They want the best deal. They are not ideologically loyal to Washington or Beijing. They are transactional. And China is offering infrastructure, investment, manufacturing partnerships, and technology transfer without the political conditions that Western institutions attach. This is not loyalty to China. This is rational self-interest, and China is winning that game. Okay? I have the players and the real interests. Now let us look at the structural realities. Structural fact number 1, China controls the raw materials of the future economy. China processes approximately 60% of the world's lithium, 85% of the world's cobalt refining capacity, and over 90% of the global supply of rare earth elements critical for semiconductors, electric vehicles, and precision weapon systems. Let me say that again. Over 90% of the world's rare earth processing runs through China. I want you to understand something. This is not an accident. China identified the strategic position in the 1990s and spent 3 decades building it with deliberate state investment. The United States, by contrast, closed its last major rare earth processing facility and only began rebuilding domestic capacity in 2022. That is a 20-year gap. The math simply does not work for an American pivot in any short time frame. Structural fact number 2. China has built the world's most resilient manufacturing system. China produces approximately 28% of global manufacturing output. It dominates over 70% of global solar panel production. It controls roughly 75% of global lithium-ion battery manufacturing capacity. And crucially, China's manufacturing depth is not just about finished goods. China controls the intermediate goods, the components that go inside the final product. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Western decoupling strategies have targeted the top layer of the supply chain while leaving the middle layers entirely intact. A factory in Vietnam or India that assembles electronics is still using Chinese-made machinery, Chinese-sourced inputs, and Chinese-trained industrial processes. The flag on the building has changed. The system underneath has not. Structural fact number 3. Every major geopolitical crisis since 2014 has accelerated China's structural position. The Ukraine war disrupted European energy systems and drove a massive acceleration in clean energy adoption, an adoption that runs almost entirely through Chinese supply chains. Western sanctions on Russia redirected Russian oil and gas exports toward China at deeply discounted prices, lowering China's energy input costs while raising costs for its competitors. The Hormuz tensions have pushed Middle Eastern states to diversify away from dollar-denominated energy contracts, with several Gulf nations already conducting energy trades in the Chinese yuan. This is not coincidence. This is how structural positioning works. You place yourself at the intersection of multiple systems. Then you let the world's instability push traffic through your node. Structural fact number 4. The United States faces a fundamental strategic dilemma it cannot resolve without accepting severe self-damage. America's military superiority is real. It is undeniable, but military power cannot bomb a supply chain. You cannot sanction rare earth processing without accelerating the very energy transition that makes rare earth dominance more powerful. You cannot decouple from Chinese manufacturing without triggering a decade of inflation that would devastate the American consumer and politically destabilize the country from within. The question is not whether America can contain China militarily. The question is whether military containment even matters when the economic architecture is already tilted. I believe this situation ends in one of two ways. And which way it ends depends on one critical question. Does the United States accept a managed transition to a multipolar economic order, or does it escalate into a confrontation that neither side can afford? Scenario 1, managed transition. In this scenario, American political leadership recognizes within the next 4 to 6 years that full decoupling is economically impossible. A series of bilateral agreements produce what is sometimes called competitive coexistence. Each side maintains its sphere of technological and financial influence. China controls the manufacturing and material systems of the clean energy economy. America retains dominance in high-level semiconductor design, financial services, and military hardware. The world becomes genuinely bipolar, not American-led. This is not a Chinese victory, but it is a fundamental revision of the post-1945 American-centered order. Most nations adapt by running relationships with both poles simultaneously. Scenario 2, confrontation cascade. In this scenario, domestic political pressure in America drives escalating trade and financial restrictions against China. China responds with calibrated countermeasures, rare earth export restrictions, currency pressure, and a systematic acceleration of relationships with global South nations through Shanghai Cooperating Organization frameworks. Taiwan becomes a focal point. A military standoff, not necessarily a war, but a sustained crisis, triggers a global supply chain rupture. The cost to both economies is severe. China's government can absorb domestic economic pain without losing power. The American government cannot absorb that same pain without facing electoral collapse and political fragmentation. History, as always, does not forgive those who ignore its lessons about asymmetric resilience. Now, here are my 3 specific predictions. Prediction 1. The first country to fully abandon dollar-denominated oil contracts in favor of yuan-denominated trade will not be Iran, and it will not be Russia. It will be a current American ally in the Gulf, and that event will mark the true beginning of the dollar's structural decline as the world's reserve currency. It will happen without a single shot fired, and the Western media will spend 6 months arguing about whether it matters. Prediction 2. Within 12 to 24 months, we will see the first major Western technology company, not a small firm, a major one, announce a structural partnership with a Chinese state enterprise that explicitly bypasses current decoupling policy. The economic pressure to access Chinese manufacturing depth will simply become too great for corporate leadership to resist. When that happens, the political consensus around decoupling will fracture. Prediction 3. The long-term outcome of this competition will not be a Chinese-led world order, and it will not be an American-led world order. It will be a systems-led world order, where whoever controls the standards, the technical standards for AI, for energy grids, for financial messaging, for data infrastructure, holds the real power. And China is currently winning the standards competition in every domain that matters for the next 50 years. Question 1. Is China not facing its own structural problems, a property crisis, demographic decline, slowing growth? My analysis is clear. Yes. China faces severe structural headwinds domestically. I am confident that the Chinese leadership understands this better than any Western analyst. But here's what matters for our framework. A declining empire that controls the material inputs of the global economy is still in a position of structural leverage. China does not need to be a growth story to be a power story. Question 2. Could America use military pressure to force a reversal of China's strategic gains? The answer is no, and here's why. Military pressure that stops short of actual war produces no structural change in supply chains, manufacturing capacity, or resource control. An actual war against China would immediately trigger a global supply chain collapse that would economically devastate the very allies America is trying to protect. The threat is not credible, and China's game theory models already account for this. Question 3. Is this analysis too pessimistic about American adaptability? Let me be very clear about this. I do not believe America is finished. American innovation capacity, financial depth, and alliance network remain formidable. But adaptability requires accepting a new reality. And every signal from American domestic politics suggests that this acceptance will be delayed. It is the delay that creates the risk. In 1453, the Byzantine Empire fell to the Ottoman forces of Sultan Mehmed II. The Byzantines had held Constantinople for over 1,000 years. They had the walls, they had the tradition, they had the prestige. But for a century before the final assault, they had been hollowed out economically. The Venetians and Genoese had taken over their trade routes. The Ottomans had cut their Silk Road access. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI stood on those ancient walls at the end with fewer than 7,000 defenders against 80,000 attackers. Not because he lacked courage, but because the economic system that was supposed to fund those defenders had been quietly redirected around him for decades. The walls fell in a single day, but the empire had been losing for 100 years. The Byzantine Empire is the United States right now. Not in its final moment. We are not there yet. But in that century of quiet redirection. The trade routes are being redrawn. The material systems are being restructured. The alliances are being tested. And the walls, the military walls, the financial walls remain impressive. The question is whether the system behind those walls still has the economic depth to sustain them. This is not just my opinion. This is one of the most well-established facts in imperial history. Empires do not fall to the army at the gate. They fall to the system that stopped flowing through them. China is not building an empire with soldiers. It is building one with systems. And the most dangerous weapon in that system is not a missile. It is indispensability. Once a nation depends on your supply chains, your materials, your manufacturing, you do not need to threaten them. They will manage themselves. This is how China conquers the world. Not with armies. With systems. The question is not whether this shift is happening. The question is whether anyone in Washington is willing to say so clearly enough to do something about it. Empires really see their own replacement coming. That is my analysis for today. Remember, this is not prophecy. This is game theory and structural history. It might be wrong. But if I am wrong, we will come back and analyze why. That is what this class is about.